All right, so we have been watching what happened with God in Genesis 1 and 2. He creates this beautiful, perfect world. He creates man in his image to rule on his behalf, to represent his interests in the world, to turn human chaos eventually into divine order. Then we see in chapters 4 through 11, we just see things spiral out of control, right? And where you have not only the creation and the fall, but now we have Noah's flood, which is a worldwide flood to demonstrate God's judgment against the wickedness of man. He preserves Noah because of his righteousness. And then you have chapter 11, in which God scrambles the language because man wants to make a name for himself and not a name for God. He doesn't want to represent God in his interests. He doesn't want to be fruitful, multiply, and fill, but he wants to have a city for his own. So all of that is just to help us understand just the really the nature of man and humanity in a fallen world and just how destructive sin is. And we're going to move from that now to this amazing act of grace that God is going to demonstrate through a man by the name of Abram. And so that is, we're going to look at chapter 12 of Genesis. This would be chapter 12, chapter 15, chapter 17 are really included in this thing called this promise that he's going to make, or an Abrahamic covenant. This is the third covenant that we've been introduced to. We saw this covenant with Adam, then we saw his covenant with Noah, and now he's going to make a covenant with Abraham. And we're going to see here that God's promise to Abraham is to make him a great nation. And that great nation is going to begin to undo the sin problem. If you think of our Bibles, if I were to hold my Bible up and you look at the first two chapters, right? This is perfection right here. Here's our perfect world in Genesis 1 and 2. And then at the end of it, we have with Revelation 23 and 24, we have it ends in perfection, right? And then what's going to happen, though, between all of that is this need to rescue man and to restore him to what God had actually intended him to be. And that is where Genesis chapter 12 comes in. So, what is going to happen in Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, is that God is going to make a very significant covenant with a man by the name of Abram. And this is the covenant. It says in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, it says this. Now, the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country, and you and your relatives, and from your father's house, and from the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, or I'll benefit you. Okay. And it goes on and says, and make your name great, which, if you think about it, God will now make Abram's name great, which is the very thing that they wanted to happen in Genesis 11, but they wanted to do it their own way. They wanted to make their name great. Never is going to work that way. God will make their name great. And it's so that you will be a blessing or a benefit to whom? And it says in verse 3, it tells us, and I will bless those who bless you. I'll benefit those who benefit you. And I will curse those who curse you. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed or benefit. Now, the first thing I want us to for sure see is that when God makes this covenant with Abram, it has nothing to do with Abram himself, because he came out of the land of Ur and he was also a pagan, had no idea who God was, but God is going to make this covenant with him. All right. And so this, when you think of the word covenant, what you want to begin to think of is it's the way, and it defines how the relationship is going to work. It defines the boundaries and the parameters of the relationship. And so God is making this covenant, and the purpose of the covenant is to make his name great. And he's going to do that by making them a nation, a great nation. All right. And now to have a nation, you need three things. You have to have people, you have to have law, and you have to have land. And so he's going to give them people, law, and land. You're going to see the people are going to be created both in this, you'll see this happen in the book of Genesis and at the beginning of the book of Exodus. And then the law is going to be introduced in Exodus and the book of Leviticus. And then he's finally going to give them the land in the book of Joshua. But unfortunately, you get the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy that are in there because the nation failed to do what they were supposed to do. But that's a story for a later time. Now, with this covenant, the whole point of this covenant is to begin to bring restoration to the human race, not just Abram and not just this nation, which will become the nation of Israel, but through that nation, that all the nations of the world would benefit if they treated God's people well. So let's first look at the nature of the covenant. If you look at the picture that I have on the screen, you will see, and what those are, it's hard to see, but you have birds and other animals, and the birds weren't cut in half because you'd have nothing left, but they were placed as part of the sacrifice. And then you have these other animals that were cut in half. And the way a covenant was cut is how they use the terminology, is that the two parties in the covenant would pass through the sacrificed animals, indicating that they were making the covenant with each other, and that if either side broke the covenant, that they would be exactly like the animals, dead. Okay, so it's stronger than when you were a kid, a pinky promise or whatever. Okay, he's making a very significant declaration. These two parties are that we are committed to this covenant, and if any one of us breaks it, we're willing to give up our life. Now, what's interesting is when you look at this covenant that God makes with Abram, and you see this in Genesis chapter 15, when these animals are cut, he puts Abraham to sleep, and he himself goes through the dead animals, through the sacrifices. And what he's saying there is this covenant is based on me and me alone. It's a unilateral covenant. It doesn't matter what Abram does and what later Abraham and his nation do. I will never, ever forsake this covenant. I will carry this through. And this becomes a really important aspect as we look at both what happens in the New Testament and why we have a Gentile involvement in the New Testament, and then why we see what happens in the time of the tribulation, and why we see what happens in the period of the millennial kingdom. It's all tied to this. I'm not going to try to make those connections now, but I want you to know that those connections are there. Okay? And then the scope of this blessing was to the entire world. It was always God's intention for the nation of Israel to reach the world. And that's what this is showing. Why would he make a covenant? Because what he's trying to do is reverse the fall and the effects of the fall. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The wages for sin is what? Death. Okay? And so he wants to help all humanity be rescued from this death sentence. And so what he does is he creates this nation. And the nation, like Adam, is to represent God and his interests in the world. Remember when we first talked about Genesis, we said that Moses is writing this for the people at the time so they know how to live amongst pagans. Well, this is how they're to live. They're to represent God and his interests in the world. And by doing that, when all the peoples of the world traveled from Europe or from Asia to Africa, or the Africans traveled up to Europe or to Asia to do trade, they all had to go right through this little sliver of a nothing country that would later be called Israel. Because on the west side, you had the sea. On the east side, you had the desert. And so there were these two main trade routes that went right through, were carved right through the nation of Israel. And that the nation, when they rightly represented God and they rightly represented his interests, and they've turned human chaos into divine order, what they were doing is they were making the invisible God visible. And so God puts them at the crossroads of the world, literally at the crossroads of the world. And that is why he chooses this people and this nation and why they are where they are. And so that's really important to understand. Now, the application of that for us today is really important also. You and I have very different spheres of people that we deal with and that we intersect with. But God has placed you and God has placed me at the crossroads of people's lives. And we have the opportunity to represent God and his interests in the world, and to make the invisible God visible, and to offer to them salvation, to be rescued from sin, to see the chaos of their lives begin to have divine order, and that their lives begin to have real meaning and real purpose. And so, like the nation of Israel, who image God before the world, we too, as images of God, are to image God before the world. And he places us in a strategic, beautiful place in your neighborhood, in your school, in your workplace, to intersect with people so that you can reveal the beauty of God to them and that they might then be saved. Now, so all this is going on, right? And he makes this promise. It's a unilateral promise, and it's dependent upon their having to be a great nation. That we said they have to have three things. They have to have people, they have to have law, and they have to have land. Well, wouldn't you know it that remember we said that Satan is now ruling over this world? In 12:10 through 16, we begin to see the satanic attack take place where he is going to use Abraham's lack of faith at this point to actually jeopardize the covenant. And it says this, right? In chapter 12, verse 10, it says, and now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there. And he goes down there. And again, I'm just going to summarize here. And what happens is, as he's there and he's amongst the people, he tells his wife, hey, Sarah, whatever you do, don't say that you're my wife, because if you do, and because you're beautiful, that could create problems and they may want to kill me. Okay, well, there's so many things wrong with that. It's incredible. First of all, if we go back to Genesis 1 through 2, we have this authority submission relationship. That is not a proper use of authority to throw your wife under the bus and to risk her life. Second of all, he wasn't representing God's interest. He was representing his own interest, and he brings a threat to the covenant because God promises it's through Abraham and Sarah that the promise is going to be fulfilled for the rescue of the world. Okay, and so the source of the threat is Abraham's lack of faith, but God intervenes and miraculously reveals to that individual that he is actually married to Sarah, and that he needs to then stay away from her. And so God then brings that whole rescue, he keeps that rescue plan intact. And so that's what we're going to see consistently, is that the people who are supposed to represent God in his interests very often begin to go and want to just deal with their own interests. And we have the same struggle, that we often are supposed to represent God and his interests in the world, but we're more concerned with our own interests than we are with his. And what we need to do when that happens is to repent, to turn from ourselves and to turn back to God and to say, God, I am fully invested in representing your interests in the world. I'm fully invested in helping my children or my neighbors or my work companions or my fellow students to come to know Christ, so that the chaos in their lives can be brought into order, so that they can have a relationship with you and they can experience that. And so this is the story. It's a beautiful story where we're introduced to Abraham, a man of faith who walked with God and who then becomes really the foundation for our understanding the nature of faith and its role in salvation and the place that God has in the rescue plan. And so I hope this has been helpful. And we're going to stop here, and then we're going to continue our study in the book of Genesis. Thanks.